When most people think of ancient Egypt, their minds immediately drift to the same glittering symbols: the towering pyramids, golden coffins, and solemn stone faces of long-dead pharaohs. It's a polished image, reinforced by textbooks, museum displays, and Hollywood itself. A place of royalty, of gods who walked among men, of mummies wrapped in silence and mystery. But that's not the Egypt most Egyptians lived in. Beyond the desert grandeur and colossal tombs was another world, one built not by kings, but by hands that went unrecorded. Farmers bent over muddy Nile fields, servants whispering in cool stone hallways, midwives hurrying through alleyways in crumbling towns, children who never saw a pyramid, men who never spoke a royal name. And it's their world that built the one we always talk about. Because while we remember the pharaohs as gods on earth, the truth is far more grounded. They were humans, flawed, political, fearful, surrounded by intrigue and expectation. And they were supported, propped up, fed, washed and dressed by an entire population whose names we rarely speak. Forget the pyramids for a moment. Forget the mummies sealed in gold. If you really want to understand ancient Egypt, start with what they ate, what they feared, how they loved, what they whispered about when the sun dipped behind the hills. Look at the dirt under their nails, not the jewels on their brows. The pyramids are still standing. That part of history endures. But the real stories, the ones that tell us what it was like to be alive then, are often written in broken walls, discarded tools, and quiet, forgotten tombs built for people who had no statues made in their honor. Let's begin there. Let's walk, not through a throne room, but down the narrow, sun-baked streets of a working-class village tucked along the Nile. The air is heavy with dust and baking bread. Children run barefoot, chasing insects. Chickens scatter. A woman kneels near a pottery jar, rinsing vegetables for supper. A man sharpens a blade on stone, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. No one here owns gold. No one here speaks to the gods. But every one of them, in their own way, is part of the divine machine that kept Egypt running for 3,000 years. They lived in homes made of mud brick, fragile and simple, yet clever in their design. Thick walls kept the interiors cool. Flat rooftops acted as sleeping spaces on hot nights. The wealthier ones had courtyards and wooden doors. The poorer ones lived shoulder to shoulder with animals. Some homes were passed down for generations. Others collapsed in floods and had to be rebuilt each year. Inside, daily life was both harsh and sacred. Meals were often simple: lentils, onions, fish from the river, flatbread cooked on hot stones, beer made from sour loaves soaked in water and left to ferment. Meat was rare, mostly reserved for offerings or celebrations. And yet, within these meals, within every bite, was a ritual. Before eating, food was sometimes placed before a small household altar. A clay figure, a painted shrine. Even the poorest homes had them. Religion wasn't a special occasion. It was woven into every movement. A prayer said while grinding flour. A charm hung over the door to ward off illness. Gods weren't distant deities. They were part of the landscape, living in the breeze, the flood, the sickness that stole a child, the dream that came before a birth. And yet, these people didn't write about themselves. Not often. Papyrus was expensive. Scribes were trained to document the lives of officials, taxes, harvests, military actions, and temple donations. Not heartache, not gossip, not the daily, mundane struggles of life. What survives are fragments, graffiti scrawled on tomb walls, messages to the dead etched in limestone, a broken bowl with a name scratched underneath. And in those fragments, We hear voices that feel startlingly familiar. A man complains that his neighbor stole a goat. A woman pleads with her dead husband to stop haunting her in dreams. A young scribe writes a clumsy love note, practicing how to flatter someone far above his station. These are the people lost beneath the monuments. They built the temples, hauled the stones, planted the grain that fed armies. And they knew their work would be forgotten. There's no glory in laying bricks, no immortality in farming. And yet, they kept building, kept planting, because living wasn't about being remembered. It was about surviving the next season. And sometimes, just sometimes, one of them rose. An artisan with clever hands might be invited to build a noble's tomb. A soldier might earn enough grain to send his son to school. A servant might become a steward. A steward might marry the right daughter. And in rare, rare cases, the name of someone born with no title at all might be inscribed in stone. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was stability, peace, order. Egypt wasn't obsessed with conquest the way other empires were. It was obsessed with balance. The right flood at the right time. The right offering for the right god. The right burial so the dead could sleep undisturbed. Even chaos was expected to behave. And that's what made it all work for so long. Not just the genius of engineers or the discipline of priests, but the quiet cooperation of ordinary people who kept showing up. Who kept kneading dough, patching walls, boiling water for cloth dye, wrapping the feet of old women, teaching children to write hieroglyphs in the dirt with sticks. We'll talk about kings, yes. But they were nothing without these hands. The kingdom didn't belong to the pharaohs. It belonged to the ones who lit the lamps before dawn, stirred the stew at noon, buried their dead at dusk, and prayed to live long enough to see the river rise again. And that's where the real Egypt waits. Not in the tombs of kings, but in the breath of the forgotten. Step behind the monuments and step into the noise. Ancient Egypt was not silent. It was full of sound, chatter, commands, the slosh of water against clay jars, the call of merchants pushing carts down sun-dried streets, and the rhythmic slap of sandals on dust. Life was busy. It's easy to imagine the past as frozen, a still image, a mural on a wall. But in reality, the ancient world pulsed with motion. Farmers rose before the sun and returned after dark. Markets opened early and stayed loud until the heat wore them out. Boats floated along the Nile like slow-moving veins, carrying goods from town to town. Barley, oil, linen, perfume. And everywhere, people bartered, haggled, shared gossip, rolled their eyes, laughed when the guards weren't looking. Most Egyptians weren't rich, but they weren't helpless either. They had small economies, markets full of trade, favors, and old debts. A woman might trade oil for fish. A potter might trade a jug for bread. And if someone skipped payment too many times, they'd be called out, not with violence, but with public embarrassment. The community remembered who cheated. Word traveled faster than the river. Children weren't hidden from this world. They learned early how to mix grain, how to carry water, how to copy numbers on worn tablets. If they were lucky, they might go to a scribe's school. But most weren't. Most learned by watching, by doing, by failing. And many didn't make it far. Infant mortality was painfully high. Even a small infection could end a life. Women gave birth with only the help of local midwives, and old knowledge passed through whispered advice. The tombs of the wealthy were filled with images of afterlives, but most families buried their dead in shallow pits outside the village. A single stone, a few tokens, a prayer. Still, there was beauty, even in the struggle. A painted pot, a carved wooden doll, a bead of blue faience tied around a child's wrist to ward off bad spirits. These people didn't create for glory, they created to keep going. A comb wasn't just for hair, it was for dignity. A song wasn't just for joy, it was for remembering. Remembering home, childhood, those who had already gone, because memory was everything. They feared being forgotten more than they feared death. That's why names mattered so much. To speak someone's name aloud was to keep them alive. To erase a name from a wall was worse than killing. It was erasure of the soul. Even criminals, when punished, had their names scratched off stone. Not as revenge, as deletion, as if they had never walked the earth at all. And so people did what they could to record themselves, not in papyrus scrolls or golden tombs, but in the quiet ways. A name painted under a pot, a joke etched into the back of a tool, a scratched prayer hidden on a doorway lintel. In a workman's village near the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists once uncovered a small, cramped home. Inside, they found a wall with dozens of simple sketches, drawn in charcoal and red ochre. Funny, strange figures. A man with a giant nose. A woman with a pot too big for her head. It wasn't art for the gods. It was just someone passing the time. Someone with a sense of humor. Someone who lived, who breathed, who saw absurdity in the world around him and chose to laugh. He's gone now. His bones, his name, his job, vanished. But his jokes remain. The lines he drew, the figures he thought were worth capturing. And that, too, is survival. Meanwhile, in the shadows of palaces, the servants moved like ghosts. Most nobles had dozens of them, men to oil their hair, women to fan the room, boys to fetch scrolls, girls to grind herbs. These servants saw everything, every affair, every whispered plot, every moment of panic or cruelty. But they were expected to vanish when spoken to. Their voices don't appear in records. But every once in a while, one slips through. A name listed on a linen inventory, a complaint scratched into a tablet, a scribble asking for more oil or fewer beatings. They lived in tight quarters, shared beds, and passed information faster than the guards could stop it. The harem women weren't just pretty faces. They had alliances, secrets, and rivalries. And the servants knew which way the wind blew long before the pharaoh did. That's what life in Egypt really was. Not gold, not marble, but layers. Layers of people stacked like bricks in a wall. Most were never seen, never praised, but all were necessary. Remove one, and the wall cracks. Remove too many, and it falls. So while we marvel at the pyramids, it's worth remembering, they weren't built for the dead. They were built on the backs of the living. People who woke up aching, squinted into the sun, and climbed scaffold after scaffold, lifting stones and prayers into the air. And at night, when the sky turned violet and the wind cooled, they lay in their huts and watched stars crawl across the heavens. Some of them dreamed of being remembered. Most just dreamed of tomorrow. Step inside the temples, and you might think Egypt was built only for gods. The ceilings soar like mountains. Pillars are carved with sacred images and holy names. Priests in spotless linen walk in shadowed silence, performing rituals older than memory. There's incense in the air, gold on every altar. The language spoken here is not meant for common ears. And yet, even these spaces, so grand, so divine, were not untouched by ordinary life. Because while the gods may have ruled the heavens, it was people who managed their houses on earth. Temples were more than holy sites. They were banks, schools, libraries, and political centers. They held grain, recorded taxes, issued blessings, and collected land. Priests didn't just pray, they managed the state's wealth. Behind every sacred offering was a contract. Behind every chant, a calculation. But beneath all that power was routine. Most priests weren't high-ranking mystics. They were more like temple workers, assigned tasks, rotating schedules, strict duties. They shaved their heads, bathed several times a day, wore only clean linen, and obeyed a tightly structured schedule. Some performed rituals. Others fed statues. Some swept floors, lit lamps, or carried offerings from storage to sanctuary. And they weren't always holy. Some were corrupt. Some took bribes. Some gossiped behind the pillars. Some stole food from the offering trays and took it home. In fact, offering food wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. The bread, beer, meat, and fruit placed before a god statue didn't just vanish. After it sat for a sacred amount of time, it was redistributed. Priests, guards, workers, they all got a share. It was how the system ran. Even gods, in Egypt, were part of the economy, and people treated them with both reverence and realism. You might pray to a goddess for protection during childbirth, but if the herbs didn't boil right or the midwife came too late, prayer alone wouldn't save you. If a flood didn't come when expected, the people didn't just wait on divine mercy. They built canals, dug trenches, stored grain, rationed food. Belief and effort walked hand in hand. Even magic, so central to daily life, wasn't all wands and chants. It was often quiet, practical, and rooted in generations of experience. Amulets were worn not just for beauty, but as shields. Spells were recited under breath while treating wounds. Salt was sprinkled across thresholds not for taste, but to keep spirits out. And magic, unlike law, belonged to everyone. A farmer might not know how to read, but he knew which symbol to draw on a door to prevent illness. A mother might not own a scroll, but she knew the lullaby that eased fever. Knowledge passed in kitchens, not classrooms. This was a world where the divine was everywhere. In the river, in the storm, in the birth of a goat or the sting of a wasp. Gods didn't live far away. They lived in the wind, in the corners of homes, in the silence before a decision. The sacred and the mundane were layered like bricks, each one necessary to hold up the whole. And that meant everyone, priest or potter, had a place in the cosmic order. Even criminals. Because justice in ancient Egypt wasn't just about punishment. It was about balance, about restoring what had been thrown off. The goddess Maat represented truth, order, and harmony. If a person lied, stole, or committed violence, they weren't just breaking a law, they were damaging the balance of the world. And so, the punishments were symbolic. A thief might have their nose cut off, not just as pain, but as a mark that they had betrayed the senses. A liar might be whipped publicly, not only to shame them, but to remind others that dishonesty was poison. And if a crime was severe enough, a person's name might be erased from records. That was the true death, because without a name, you couldn't enter the afterlife. You couldn't be remembered. And in this world, remembrance was everything. That's why tombs mattered so much, not just to pharaohs, but to anyone who could afford one. A small stone, a few hieroglyphs, a figure carved in profile, arms raised in offering. These were not luxuries. They were survival. But only the lucky were buried well. Most people were placed in shallow graves, sometimes wrapped, sometimes not. A few possessions. A necklace. A pair of sandals. A prayer scratched on clay. Their tombs were not sealed with curses. They were dug by neighbors, watched by weeping wives, and forgotten by history. And yet, they mattered, because for every golden coffin in a museum, there are thousands who simply returned to the soil. No monuments, no priests, just the echo of footsteps, the trace of laughter, the breath of people who once lived and loved and struggled and believed. They were the breath of Egypt. They kept the fields sown, the temples supplied, the gods fed, and the pharaohs clothed. Their lives were not silent. They were full of music, chores, arguments, secrets, full of illness and healing, hunger and feast, birth and burial, and in every cracked wall and broken jar, their story remains, waiting to be heard again. Walk into an ordinary Egyptian home, not the palace, not the temple, and you'll find it full of quiet rituals. The woman of the house rises before sunrise, long before the streets grow noisy. Her hands know the motion of grinding grain into flour without thinking. The same rhythm, every day, back and forth, stone against stone. A dull sound, but a steady one. In that soft grinding lies the heartbeat of the household. The children still sleep. The fire has not yet been stoked. But she is awake, like her mother before her, like every woman who understood that life is sustained not with declarations, but with repetition. A man prepares nets. Another oils his sandals. Somewhere, someone is singing to the gods, but louder than the prayer is the sigh of someone stretching sore arms, the slap of dough into shape, the muttering of a sleepy boy told to fetch water. This is not ceremony. This is survival. And still, these homes, humble as they were filled with care. Pottery etched with fish, flowers, or protective eyes. Mats woven by hand, reeds softened by use. Oil lamps that flickered just enough to keep away shadows and make the evenings feel less wide. In these small gestures, dignity lived. People made beauty, not because they could afford it, but because they needed it. Family wasn't always how we imagine it today. Marriage, as we know it, was informal. There weren't grand ceremonies for most. A man and woman agreed to live together, to raise children, to share a home. That was enough. Legal contracts were written when property or inheritance was involved. But love? That was spoken, lived, not signed. And yes, there was love. Letters found in the ruins of workers' villages speak of yearning. Men writing to wives, missing their voices, promising to bring dried figs. Women writing to absent husbands, asking for news, describing children's antics, worrying about water shortages. There's nothing stiff or formal about them. They sound like people you know. Tired, hopeful, a little annoyed, deeply loyal. Not all was easy. Men sometimes took more than one partner, though it wasn't common among the poor. Divorce wasn't scandalous. If things didn't work, people parted. Children might go with the mother. A new partner might join the family. There was flexibility, but there was also a clear sense of responsibility. Children had to be fed. Elders respected. Property, even if small, honored. And children were the center of it all. Their lives were fragile, but deeply cherished. Babies were named after gods, after stars, after seasons. Mothers placed charms around their necks. Fathers taught them to count, to recite prayers. Girls helped with weaving and cooking. Boys learned fishing, farming, or writing if their fathers were scribes. No one was idle. Play, too, had its place. Dolls made of clay or cloth. Spinning tops. Animal carvings. Simple board games like Senet were not just entertainment. They were symbolic, linked to fate, to the afterlife. Children played with rules they didn't fully understand, But the joy was real. Even in the hardest seasons, laughter echoed in narrow homes. But joy sat beside grief. Illness was everywhere. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools. A cut could become fatal. A fever might take a child before sunset. When someone died, neighbors gathered, not just to mourn, but to share the burden. Wailing wasn't seen as weakness. It was necessary. A loud grief told the gods that a soul had been loved, that it mattered. Some had formal funerals. Others did what they could. A burial near the house. A hand-painted pot to hold offerings. A bowl of dates. A carved figure to guard the spirit. These weren't expensive gestures, but they were sacred. Death was not the end. Not in Egypt. It was only a crossing. And so, the living kept living, with memory stitched into everything they did. Clothing wasn't elaborate for most. Linen, coarse or soft, depending on your station. Men wore short kilts. Women draped dresses over one shoulder or both. Jewelry, even for the poor, had meaning. Beads shaped like eyes or animals to bring protection. Hair was kept short or shaved in heat, sometimes covered with wigs or cloth. Cleanliness mattered more than fashion. To be dusty was ordinary. To be filthy was shameful. Bathing was done in the open, with water poured from jugs. Oil was rubbed onto the skin, then scraped off with curved tools to remove dirt. Scented oils were prized, not just for smell, but to soothe bites, cuts, sunburn. Smelling good meant something. It meant care. It meant presence. And beneath all this, class lines pulsed quietly. A scribe's hands were soft, but his mind was sharp. A farmer's body was strong, but worn. A noble's child might never lift a tool. A servant might never see his own child grow. Slavery existed, not always in chains, but often through debt, capture, or inheritance. Some could buy freedom, some never did. And yet, the lines were sometimes blurred. A servant might become favored. A laborer might be honored. There was movement, if not often, then at least possible. And that possibility kept hope alive. Because for all its cruelty, Egypt allowed room for ambition. If your son learned to write, he could work in a temple or an office. If your daughter married into the right household, she might never carry a jug again. Dreams weren't only for the highborn. They were for anyone who looked up from the fields and thought, there must be more than this. And so they planted, washed, prayed, carved, stitched, sold, carried, and dreamed. And in that dreaming, they gave Egypt its true shape. For all the paintings of serene gods and eternal balance, life in ancient Egypt was often a game of endurance. Work was the axis around which everything spun. It didn't matter if you were strong or clever. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And work, in Egypt, had many faces. The farmers, of course, were the backbone of everything. Their lives followed the rhythm of the Nile, planting after the flood, tending during the dry months, harvesting before the next rise. There were no machines, no shortcuts. Every field was touched by hand. Every seed, every stalk, every bundle of wheat tied and carried. They didn't own the land. They borrowed it from temples, nobles, or the crown. In return, they gave up a portion of what they grew. It was called a tax, but it often felt like survival paid forward. And yet, despite the back-breaking labor, they were proud. A good harvest meant security. A strong ox meant fewer injuries. A well-dug canal meant water when the skies gave nothing. Farmers knew they weren't wealthy, but they knew their work kept everything standing. Even the palace feasts came from their grain. Craftsmen were another world altogether. They didn't just work, they created. Potters, leatherworkers, carpenters, stonecutters, weavers. Each had a specialty, and in villages like Deir el-Medina, the community of tomb builders, they formed close-knit groups, often with secrets of their own. These weren't random laborers. They were trained, skilled, selected, trusted. They carved the tombs of kings. But they didn't always live like kings' servants. Inside their village walls, they had private homes, gardens, sometimes even pets. Their days were long but structured. They were paid in grain, beer, and oil. They had rest days and holidays. And their walls, their walls were filled with scribbles, humor, jealousy, crude drawings, prayers. This was not some elite, polished class. These were workers, with sore hands and sharp minds. But work came with risk. Speak out too loudly, and you could disappear. Disobey a foreman, and you might lose your rations. If grain deliveries were delayed, hunger crept in fast. There are records of strikes. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, where tomb workers refused to enter the Valley of the Kings until they were fed. They didn't shout. They sat in silence, outside the worksite, writing formal complaints. Their language was calm, but beneath it pulsed a very modern desperation. We have done our part. Now keep your promise. And even among the builders of legacies, loyalty could be dangerous. If a worker spoke too much about the layout of a tomb, he could be executed. Secrets were sacred, not for magic, but for security. A king's tomb held more than his body. It held wealth, and the threat of theft was constant. Grave robbing wasn't rare. It was expected. Even in death, inequality whispered. The royal tombs were buried deep, lined with curses, guarded by the gods, or so the inscriptions said. But curses didn't stop hungry men. A man whose children were starving might risk anything. Steal a golden mask, smash a statue, melt down a sacred ornament and sell it piece by piece. It was crime, yes, but it was also hunger, and those caught faced brutal consequences. Hands chopped, eyes removed. Sometimes the robber's body was left on display outside the village, not just as punishment, but as warning. Not all who defied the gods did so for greed. Many just wanted to survive. This was a truth most Egyptians understood. Obedience was not always virtue. Silence was safety. People learned early not to ask too many questions. If a neighbor vanished, you didn't speak his name. If a noble's son was arrested for heresy, you erased his face from a mural and painted someone else. If the temple closed its doors for 3 days, you offered a prayer outside and kept moving. Politics were not discussed in open courtyards. Pharaohs were not mocked in jest. And yet, beneath the surface, there was resistance. Quiet, clever resistance. A satire scribbled in the corner of a scroll. A tiny figure in a tomb painting drawn with crossed eyes. Hidden jokes. Inside references. Little rebellions painted where only trusted hands would ever see. The people knew how to play both games, the game of survival and the game of self. They could bow to the image of the king in daylight and still whisper about his foolishness by firelight, not because they were unfaithful, but because they were human. To live under absolute rule did not mean blind loyalty. It meant learned caution. A farmer might pray for the pharaoh's health and curse his tax collector in the same breath. A servant might light incense for the queen and still resent her cruelty. Faith and frustration lived side by side. Even the gods weren't exempt. In times of drought or plague, people didn't just pray louder. They got angry. Angry at the river, at the gods, at fate. Some people stopped worshipping altogether. Others built new altars, tried new charms, worshipped older gods or stranger ones, or made their own combinations in desperate hope. And when nothing worked, they grieved. But even grief had rules. Wailing too loudly might disturb a neighbor. Mourning too long might be seen as disrespect to the living. And so, people learned to carry their losses with poise. But always, always, they remembered. They remembered those who fell while building. Those who were buried too poor to afford a priest. Those who were loved, but never honored in stone. Because in Egypt, even silence carried memory. And the strongest voices weren't always loud. Sometimes they were written in charcoal on limestone scraps, tucked into cracks in the wall. A name, a plea, a line of poetry, not meant for the ages, just meant to last, just long enough to be found again. We are taught to see ancient Egypt through a lens of grandeur, temples and tombs, kings and conquests. But we forget that behind the statues and scrolls were people who laughed, flirted, yearned, and touched. People who blushed, who longed for glances, who carried desire as quietly as they carried faith. Pleasure wasn't hidden in ancient Egypt. It was celebrated, even if gently. Music, perfume, flowers, dancing. These were not indulgences for the elite alone. They were part of the soul's rhythm. A gathering of friends might include wine, lute players, and bowls of dates. A festival might be loud with drums and song. And even in a modest home, someone might hum a love song while preparing dinner. The Egyptians believed that joy was a part of divine balance. A world without laughter, without beauty, was a world out of tune with Ma'at, the concept of harmony that guided all things. To make love, to feel joy, to share sweetness, was to honor life. Sex was not wrapped in shame. It was woven into everyday existence. Carvings, poems, and even private letters reveal a culture that acknowledged intimacy with tenderness and realism. Lovers were not expected to be chaste. They were expected to be kind, faithful, present. The body was a vessel, yes, but it was also a source of wisdom, healing, and connection. Perfume played a role in this, not just for scent, but for memory. A certain oil could signal courtship. A mixture of blue lotus and myrrh could stir warmth in the heart. Lovers exchanged small jars of fragrance, wore scented cones on their heads, and used oils not only to mask sweat, but to whisper intent. Even clothing could flirt. Linen was light, breathable, and often worn in styles that showed the curve of the shoulder or the line of the waist. Jewelry highlighted the collarbone, the wrist, the ankle. It wasn't about revealing too much. It was about accenting what already spoke. Poetry was the language of the heart. In preserved verses scratched onto pottery and papyrus, we hear the soft voices of men and women speaking across time. A girl writes of her desire to be near a boy who waters his garden. A man writes of his longing to hold his beloved's hand, not in secret, but under the sun. These are not wild declarations. They are quiet devotions, fragments of affection, the kind that come between chores, between errands, between breaths. Marriage, too, was not just political. While some unions were arranged for wealth or stability, others were chosen freely. A man and a woman might meet at the market, exchange goods, share jokes, share meals, and then simply agree to live together. That was enough to be called husband and wife. Children might follow, or not. The bond mattered more than the title. If love faded, parting was possible. No great scandal, No ruined name. Just change. But not all love was allowed. Some connections broke rules. Of class, of family, of faith. A priest might be forbidden from intimacy. A royal woman might fall for a common guard. A scribe might keep secret letters hidden in the folds of his robes. And when caught, the punishment was often not violence, but silence, removal, a name scratched out from the record, a face painted over in a mural. To be forgotten was the cruelest sentence. And yet, love persisted, because in a world filled with labor, with dust and heat and tax and toil, desire was a form of rebellion. To want, to yearn, to ache for softness, was to declare that the soul was still alive, that something beyond obligation could exist, that one's heart could still stir like the reeds on the Nile. In the court of the pharaoh, desire was often political. Royal women were chosen carefully, their beauty praised, but also their lineage measured. The king's concubines lived in guarded quarters, tended by eunuchs, wrapped in fine linens, but not always free. Some found power by giving birth to royal heirs. Others faded into obscurity, never called to the king's chamber again. But even there, behind walls of perfume and politics, friendships bloomed, affection grew. There are records of palace women writing each other songs, of private dances meant only for one another. The harem was not only a prison, it was also a network, a world within a world, where softness survived behind hard stone. And sometimes that softness took bold shape. In the Turin erotic papyrus, a rare graphic piece of art from the ancient world, we see scenes that scholars still puzzle over. Lovers in tangled poses, exaggerated bodies, smiles, laughter, intimacy without shame. Was it satire? Was it sacred? Was it fantasy? No one knows for sure. But what it tells us is clear. The ancient Egyptians were not afraid to see themselves as whole. They honored the body alongside the soul. They didn't divide the sacred from the sensual. They saw love, even in its messiest forms, as part of the grand design. And perhaps that is what made their joy so enduring. It wasn't loud. It wasn't always lawful. But it was present. It lived in the way someone leaned closer when speaking, in the way someone saved the best fig for another, in the way fingers brushed by accident and didn't pull away. The sun, so central to their religion, also brought burns, blisters, exhaustion. The Nile, their lifeline, carried water and disease. A simple cut could turn into a fever. A cough could become something worse. And yet, they survived. Not through miracle alone, but through knowledge passed down from healer to healer, from mother to daughter, from scribe to apprentice. Medicine was not a mystery to the Egyptians. It was a craft. Their approach was neither purely mystical nor purely scientific. They understood that the body was made of parts, limbs, organs, fluids. They knew the importance of the pulse. They measured breath. They examined urine. They checked the color of the tongue. They listened. They observed. And when needed, they treated. Healers, often scribes or priest-physicians, carried scrolls filled with remedies. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts ever discovered, lists hundreds of treatments. Some involved herbs, garlic for the heart, honey for wounds, willow bark for pain. Others involved rituals, incantations to drive out illness caused by malevolent spirits. Still others were a combination, medicine and magic, intertwined like reeds in the river. Because illness wasn't just seen as physical. It was spiritual, social, emotional. A pain in the stomach might be caused by spoiled food, or by a curse, or by guilt. A headache might be the result of sun exposure, or a bad dream. The boundary between body and spirit was thin, and so treatment came in layers. A woman with a sick child might seek out a midwife or healer. She might burn incense to a household god, place amulets near the bed, sprinkle salt in the corners of the room. She might recite a charm while stirring a mixture of dates, crushed herbs, and oil. If the child cried, she held him. If he slept, she watched the breath rise and fall, waiting, hoping. There were no hospitals. Treatment happened at home, or in temples, or in special healing sanctuaries dedicated to gods like Imhotep, a mortal once, who became the patron of medicine. These temples were not cold stone chambers. They were quiet, clean, and surrounded by gardens. Water trickled softly, birds sang, patients rested, and healers walked slowly, gently, listening for more than symptoms. Sometimes healing meant letting go. The elderly weren't hidden. They lived among family, watched over by grandchildren, honored in evening prayers. Wrinkles were not feared. They were proof of endurance. A woman with bent knees and dimming eyes might still be asked for advice. A man with missing teeth might still carry stories from the time of forgotten kings. And when the time came to die, death was met with preparation, not panic, because death was not the end. Not in Egypt. The dying were washed, their nails cleaned, their hair combed, a few final words spoken, sometimes between sips of water or honey, sometimes with only a held hand. The family would call for a ritualist or embalmer if they could afford one. If not, they did the work themselves. And then came mourning. Grief had texture in Egypt. It had sound. Women wove their sorrow into ululations, long rising cries that echoed across the village walls. Men wept without shame. Children were told stories of the dead, not to forget, but to remember with warmth. There were offerings, bread, beer, oil, flowers, and there were questions whispered to the gods. Was she ready? Did he find the river that leads to the field of reeds? Was the heart light enough to pass the test? Because in the afterlife there was a weighing. The heart of the deceased was placed on one side of a scale, the feather of Marat on the other. Too heavy with sin, and the heart would be devoured by a beast. Balanced, and the soul passed on, to a place not of gold, but of familiar joys. Trees, laughter, family, a simple home, fields to till, love without pain. To prepare for this, many people carried charms. The eye of Horus for protection, the scarab for rebirth, the ankh for life. Not all were expensive. Some were clay, some carved from wood, but all were personal, tied with string, hidden under linen, worn until worn out. Healing wasn't only for the sick. It was for the whole community. If one child fell ill, the neighbors knew. Someone sent water. Someone else brought garlic. A grandmother mixed a tonic. A neighbor stood watch. Sickness was not a private affair. It was shared, as survival always had been. Pregnancy, too, was a time of both celebration and fear. A pregnant woman was considered sacred, but vulnerable. She drank special teas, avoided certain foods, slept with amulets tied near her belly. Her mother or aunt would sit with her for hours, telling her what to expect, what to fear. The birth itself could be long, messy, uncertain. Some babies did not survive. Some mothers didn't either. But when they did, it was a quiet miracle. The newborn was washed in warm water, rubbed with oil, swaddled, given a name after a god, a season, a star, and life began again. A cycle repeated, not for glory, but for continuity. Because health, in ancient Egypt, wasn't perfection. It was persistence. To wake up each morning with enough strength to work, to eat, to smile, to love, that was enough. To make it through another flood season. To survive another summer heat. To carry grief without breaking. To heal, even slowly, even partially. That was everything. You couldn't go far in ancient Egypt without feeling the presence of something greater. It wasn't always loud or dramatic. There weren't lightning bolts from the sky or fire from heaven. But the air was full of presence. Carvings on walls. Statues with wide, unblinking eyes. Temples rising above fields like stone prayers. Belief wasn't separate from life. It was the thread that wove everything together. But belief didn't always look like worship. A farmer might nod to the rising sun, whisper a name under his breath, then go straight to his tools. A mother might tie a small scrap of linen around her daughter's wrist, not because she understood the charm's origin, but because her grandmother had done it too. Ritual lived in repetition. Meaning lived in motion. The gods were everywhere, hundreds of them, big and small, wild and domestic. Some ruled the skies, like Ra, the sun god, who rowed his boat through the heavens. Some lived in the reeds, like Taurit, the hippo-shaped goddess who protected women in childbirth. Others were mysterious, like Thoth, the ibis-headed keeper of wisdom, or Butet, the feline figure whose purring grace could bless or destroy. These gods were not distant. They were friends, guardians, neighbors. They had moods. They had families. They made mistakes. They helped. They punished. And the people loved them not because they were perfect, but because they felt real. Temples were their homes. But ordinary people didn't enter the inner sanctums. Only priests walked among the statues, washed them, dressed them in fine linens, anointed them with oil and perfume. The gods didn't speak, at least not aloud, but through symbols, dreams, omens, through birds flying in strange patterns, through the crack of thunder on a clear day, through a baby laughing when no one else did. Still, people visited the outer courtyards of temples. They brought offerings, bread, onions, beer, incense. Some asked for healing, others for justice. A few asked for nothing, just bowed, lit a flame, and walked away. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about connection. Some gods were deeply personal. A man who fished the river might feel close to Sobek, the crocodile god. A woman who'd lost a child might pray to Isis, not for miracles, but for comfort. A scribe who feared failure might keep a statue of Thoth near his writing tools, not to impress, but to steady his hand. Belief didn't require education. It required hope. Hope that the seasons would return, that illness would pass, that your ancestors still watched over you, that the scales in the afterlife would be kind, because everyone knew that death wasn't just an ending, it was a test, and preparing for that test began early. If you had means, you commissioned a coffin, a shabty figurine, maybe a painted scroll to guide your soul. If you didn't, you saved what you could. You taught your children the names of the gods. You whispered the prayers that helped the dead find their way. You made peace with the idea that your memory might live longer than your body. Not everyone feared death. Some welcomed it, as rest, as return, as reunion. But even the most faithful had doubts. A man might stare at the stars and wonder if the gods were truly listening. A woman might weep over a lost baby and question the fairness of it all. A young girl, newly married, might light a lamp and ask it to carry her wishes upward, not knowing if anyone was listening. Still, they believed, not because they had proof, but because belief was warmth, a blanket against uncertainty, a story passed down so many times it felt like truth, even if it changed along the way. Magic and religion often blurred. A healer's chant might call on a god. A love charm might use divine symbols. A curse might be written on a pot and smashed into the earth. Some spells were meant to protect, others to bind. A jealous rival, a cruel overseer, a wandering lover. It wasn't superstition. It was survival, shaped into words. And those words held power. Hieroglyphs were not just letters. They were life. A name written was a soul remembered. A prayer carved into stone might echo for centuries. That's why erasure was feared more than death. To be forgotten, to have your name removed from a wall, was to die a second time. So people told stories of gods who cried, who raged, who danced, who healed, of mortals who defied the odds, who loved too deeply, who suffered and still believed, of journeys taken after death, past gates and guardians, toward light. These stories were not always logical, not always clean, but they were deeply human, and in them the Egyptians found meaning. They didn't seek a perfect world. They sought balance. Not endless joy, but harmony. Not victory, but continuity. To live in rhythm with the river, with the seasons, with the gods, that was enough. And every statue, every charm, every whispered prayer was a way to say, I am here. I see you. Remember me. Even in a world shaped by gods and grain, war was never far away. Egypt, for all its grandeur, was never immune to conflict. Borders shifted like sand dunes. Ambitions grew. Rivals emerged. The pharaoh, often shown with mace and crown, was not only a ruler. He was a warrior. His image was carved into temple walls. Chariots charging, enemies trampled beneath divine horses, arms lifted high in eternal triumph. But war was not only won in carvings. In truth, battles were messy. They were slow, unpredictable, and cruel. A single campaign could last months. Soldiers traveled far from home, enduring desert heat, foreign sickness, and the fear of never returning. Some went willingly, for pay, for honor, for a sense of purpose. Others were conscripted, pulled from their farms, told to serve the pharaoh's will without question. They trained with wooden weapons, practiced formations, learned to follow orders. Discipline was survival, but so was luck. Their armor was limited, their protection thin. Shields were made of leather and wood. Spears, bronze-tipped, and chariots, those symbols of prestige, were not for everyone. Only a select few rode with such status. Most walked, marched, waited. The sounds of war were not glorious. They were screams, splintered bones, the hiss of arrows, dust in the eyes, blood on the sand. The Egyptians believed the gods chose the victor, but even the devout felt doubt when surrounded by death. When soldiers returned, they did not always bring glory. Some came back wounded. Some never spoke again. Some carried invisible scars, memories of friends lost, of children orphaned, of cities burned. There were no grand victory parades for the common man. Only silence, and perhaps a better ration, a new tool, a small plot of land promised and sometimes delivered. And then, just as suddenly as it began, war became politics again. New borders were drawn. New marriages arranged. Old enemies renamed as allies. And life resumed, at least for those still breathing. But not all power came from swords. Power also lived in law. Egyptian justice was not simple, but it was structured. There were local officials, scribes, judges, people responsible for keeping order. Most disputes weren't about treason or rebellion. They were about boundaries, broken agreements, theft, insults, debts unpaid. Two neighbors might argue over a piece of land. A woman might accuse a man of failing to provide for their child. A servant might claim his master beat him without cause. These were not whispered matters. They were brought forward, written down, and often judged in open court. Punishment varied. For the poor, it might mean lashes, forced labor, or repayment. For the wealthy, it might mean shame, fines, loss of privilege. There was no pretense of equality, but there was a deep respect for process. Testimonies were collected, witnesses called, documents reviewed, and even the smallest voices, sometimes, were heard. But justice had shadows. There were crimes that brought harsher ends. Grave robbing, treason, blasphemy. These were not just sins, they were threats to the order of the world. And the punishments reflected that. Execution, mutilation, erasure from records. A man found guilty of stealing from a tomb might be killed and buried without ceremony. No charms, no name, no afterlife, because to steal from the dead was to steal from eternity. And yet, even justice had its loopholes. A clever scribe might forge a document. A wealthy merchant might bribe a judge. A priest might silence a scandal with a generous offering to the temple. Truth, like the Nile, could be redirected, if you knew how. But ordinary people knew when they were powerless. They felt it when they paid taxes with the last of their grain, when a noble's son escaped punishment, when a land deed vanished under mysterious circumstances. Still, they endured. Not because they trusted the system, but because they knew how to move within it. Caution became wisdom. Humility became armor. Patience became survival. And in between the cracks, they found ways to speak. A satirical tale here. A hidden phrase carved under a statue's foot. A fable passed down at night about a poor man who outsmarted the gods. These were not revolts, but reminders. That memory outlives marble. That stories outlast kings. Power in Egypt was monumental. It built stone giants. It reshaped rivers. But it never fully controlled the human spirit. Even slaves, those at the very bottom, found ways to resist. Through escape. Through sabotage. Through whispered songs that carried the weight of pain without alerting a master. Not every bondman accepted his fate. Some ran, some fought, some simply endured, knowing that endurance itself was a form of defiance. Women, too, carved space within the system. While most political power rested with men, women could inherit land, own businesses, act as witnesses in court. Some rose higher. Temple singers, administrators, even queens who ruled as pharaoh. But most simply lived, balancing duty and desire. Their strength wasn't in titles. It was in the way they raised children, held families together, navigated risk with grace. And when history tried to forget them, they left traces anyway. In ink, in linen, in fragments buried beside their names. Because in Egypt, the truest form of resistance was to remain visible. Not in monuments, but in moments. In a lover's poem that survived on clay. In a grain ledger that listed a mother's name. In a footprint left accidentally in drying mortar. Still there, thousands of years later. Proof that someone once walked here. That someone once dared to leave a mark. If you were to walk through modern Egypt today, past the honking cars and the cluttered cafes, you might catch a glimpse of something older, quieter, a face carved in faded stone, a name half scratched into a crumbling wall, a pattern on a piece of broken pottery lying where the wind has forgotten it. The past is never far here. But what truly remains of ancient Egypt isn't the pyramids. Not really. Those mighty triangles, though impressive, tell only a sliver of the story. They speak of kings, of grandeur, of what power tried to make permanent. But they don't whisper. They don't breathe. They don't laugh. The real Egypt lived elsewhere. It lived in kitchen courtyards and riverbanks, in fields at dawn and bedrooms lit by oil lamps. It lived in the hands of women kneading bread, in the backs of men bent over fishing nets, in the silence of scribes, in the songs of children, in the prayers of the dying. It lived in people, just like us, people who felt hunger and joy, hope and regret, people who argued with their parents, who worried about money, who told jokes that no one wrote down, who kissed someone good night and hoped to see them again in the morning. We find pieces of them everywhere, in the faint remains of graffiti scratched into the walls of tombs, not blasphemy, but humanity. Names, hearts, little jokes. I was here. I saw this. Remember me. In letters written on pottery shards, notes passed between friends and lovers, shopping lists, apologies, warnings, not declarations of greatness, but quiet records of living, in sandals worn through at the heel, in combs with broken teeth, in linen shrouds folded with care over the bodies of those who would never wake again, but whose loved ones still hoped they would be warm. The pharaohs ruled for centuries. They built with stone. They spoke with authority. But they are no longer here to speak for themselves. Their tombs have been emptied. Their names, once feared, are now recited by tourists and schoolchildren. But the nameless ones, the farmer, the maid, the potter, the child, they left something purer. They left behind rhythm. A rhythm of life that beats beneath the ruins. A way of living that was deeply rooted in the earth, in community, in the ordinary. They didn't need to be remembered as gods. They just wanted to be remembered. And somehow, they are. Because every time we read a love poem written 3,000 years ago and feel the same ache, every time we see a painting of a mother holding her baby and recognize that same gentle curve, every time we walk along the Nile and feel the same breeze they felt, touch the same stones they walked on, we are remembering them. They endure not because they were immortal, but because they were human. It's tempting to think that history belongs to the powerful, to kings and conquerors, to those with armies and architects and gold. But history belongs to everyone who lived, everyone who left behind something, a word, a sigh, a trace. And Egypt, more than any other ancient world, is a country built on those traces. It is a land of echoes, a land where the past is never quite finished, never fully silent, a place where the line between memory and myth is soft, where you can stand in a field and still feel the weight of a woman's footsteps, carrying water for her children, where you can touch a carved wall and wonder if the man who shaped it also hummed to himself while he worked, where you can look into the eyes of a statue and know, deep in your bones, that someone once looked into those same eyes and saw themselves. So forget the pyramids, if you must. Forget the gold, the mummies, the tourists snapping selfies under the blazing sun. Instead, remember the rest. Remember the ones who made the bread, who carved the combs, who cried at funerals and danced at weddings, who lived not to be famous, but to be present. That is Egypt's greatest treasure. Not what they built, but what they felt. And the quiet miracle that, after all this time, we still feel it too.